Now let's see the case of a web panel with one grid. Here we're receiving by parameter the identifier of a country. Also, we're showing in a grid all its tourist attractions, and in the fixed part, the name of that country. When the web panel has at most one grid, we can say that if there is a base table, there's no difference between talking about the base table of the web panel and about the base table of the grid. Why? Because it will not be possible, as it happens in the case of plain panels, that is, those developed to run with Angular, for example, or with Android or Apple, that there is a navigation for the fixed part of the panel and a different one for the grid. For web panels with one grid, if there is a base table, it'll be unique. And what should happen, if it's correctly implemented, is that the attributes of the fixed part must have the same value for all the records of the base table that are going to be loaded into the grid, because otherwise they should be in the grid and not in the fixed part. Here, all the attractions that pass the conditions filters and belong to the country received by parameter will be loaded into the grid. Therefore, for all of them, the country name will be the same, and that's why it's in the fixed part. Note that we'll be receiving by parameter in the country ID attribute that doesn't participate in determining the possible base table, but it does act as a filter on the navigations that Genexus finds, as we saw in the previous case. What parts of the web panel are taken into account to determine the base table? Obviously, when there is a grid, in addition to the places we'd already seen for the previous case, everything related to the grid is added. Therefore, if attributes appear there, or in the order properties, conditions, unique, data selector, and of course, if a base transaction is specified in the corresponding property, then the grid, and therefore the web panel, will have an implicit base table. Obviously, if there is a base transaction, all of the attributes of the form, and those that are in loose events, must belong to its extended table. Otherwise, Genexus will warn us about which attributes will not be attainable and will have no value. If no base transaction was specified, then, as in the case of the web panel without a grid, Genexus will find it by looking for the minimum extended table, containing all the attributes that appear in the places we defined. Its base table will be the selected base table. Before looking at the events, we can say that the base table will be attraction because there's a base transaction. And we confirm that all these other attributes belong to its extended table. So if there wasn't a single event programmed, we would still note that the attraction table will be run through, ordering it by country ID and attraction name, filtering by the attractions whose attraction name meets these two conditions, and also whose country matches the one received by parameter. Let's say it one last time. For web panels, if there is a grid, the attributes of the fixed part correspond to the navigation of the grid. Then we'll see that if there are several grids, they'll correspond to the navigation of one of them. If we were not receiving data in the country ID attribute, then, since attractions from different countries will be loaded into the grid, what value will the country name attribute take on screen? One could easily suspect that it'll be either the first or the last one of the records loaded into the grid. Let's try it. Here we have the web panel correctly programmed. First, let's see its navigation list. And we see that, indeed, there is a base table, which is attraction. We see it clearly defined at the level of the load event of the grid. And now we'll run it before modifying the parameter. From this other web panel, we invoke ours. Now let's make changes to our panel so that instead of receiving data in the country ID attribute, it's received in the country ID variable. And so there is no automatic filter. Let's look at the navigation list. We see that now there will be no filter. And let's see it at runtime. Note that it loaded as country name that of the first of the records and not of the last one. Well, let's leave the parameter as we had it. If we now look at the events, we notice that obviously the load event was programmed already knowing that the grid would have a base table. If we analyze as Genexus does which attributes will participate in determining the base table, we can see that they are all loose. Clearly, trip date does not. It only participates in the determination of the table to be navigated by the count formula. Of course, and just like with the web panel in general, if the grid has a base table, then this count formula can also have an implicit condition, which in this case is that it'll count the trips of the tourist attraction that are about to be loaded. As we've seen before, it's not enough to replace all the attributes we show with variables everywhere if we forget to do it in one of these places. For example, here we made a save as from the previous panel to implement it without a base table. We changed all the attributes of the form to variables, and also those same attributes in the events. In fact, we programmed the load event of the grid by specifying the for each command to run through the attraction table and load all the variables of the grid, and also the one of the fixed part, country name, thinking that we're programming the web panel without a base table. We did not specify a base transaction to the for each, but we could have. We know that it'll be filtered by country ID because it's being received by parameter, and also that this attribute of the parm rule does not participate in determining the base table. But where are we specifying the filters by attraction name? We forgot about them. We forgot to change the properties of the grid as well. And the properties of the grid do determine the base table. Note that these three properties that we omitted are establishing a base table. As a matter of fact, let's see what the navigation list says. Precisely, it found the attraction base table, so it'll execute the load n times, filtering by country received by parameter, and also by the variables according to the conditions we specified in the grid. And for each of those records, it'll execute the for each of the load, making a control break because the base table is the same, attraction. All that because we forgot to check the properties of the grid. So, what we must do is bring these properties to the for each command. First, the base transaction, then the order, and finally, the conditions as where clauses. We save. It's causing this error because there shouldn't be a semicolon in the syntax of the for each. We save again. Okay. We check the navigation list. This time, we managed to ensure that the web panel has no base table. Note that if we place the where clauses as conditions, but not of the grid, but as general conditions of the web panel, as it happened in the case of a panel without a grid, the attributes of these conditions do not participate in determining a base table. Here we can see it clearly. The navigation list is not different from the previous one. The problem with the general conditions is that they're going to be applied as filters on the entire web panel navigation that involves its attributes. And sometimes, we're not interested in that. Let's think, for example, in the case of having multiple grids. In general, it's better practice to implement web panels with a base table because it saves us all this work. Here, we had to establish the for each, assign the values of the attributes to the variables, and specify the load command to load each line. On the other hand, in the version with a base table, we can see that everything was much simpler. But what would we do if we only wanted to load attractions that are in more than one trip? This is very simple in the web panel without a base table. We would condition the load command to the value of the trips variable. We only load a line on the grid if the trips variable is greater than 1. Otherwise, we don't load it. But what about the web panel with a base table? It would seem that we can't do it here, given that the load is executed when the grid line is about to be loaded. Also, it would seem that we have no way of stopping the load because the load command that was explicit in this other one here is implicit. Genexus places it in its source code, but not us. However, we can do it. If we program the load explicitly, then Genexus understands that it should not place its own. We could say that it leaves it in our hands. Let's try it.